Good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the last in our Fall 2021 series of virtual art and focus programs, where our object today is this plaster cast after a marble original of about 1493 to 1495, depicting a Madonna and Child by the Florentine sculptor Benedetto da Maiano. So this is the second plaster cast that we featured in the series this fall. The other, you might remember, was the Augustus as Pontifex Maximus plaster cast. And in part, that has been because I have been taking advantage of this being a virtual series to focus on objects that will be a little bit more difficult to have in-person art and focus events around. So in the case of the Augustus plaster cast, that's in our storage facility in Loyola Hall at Fairfield. There's not a lot of space where it lives currently. And this plaster cast is actually installed in the Jesuit residence on campus. So while I'm sure that the Jesuits would be welcome to a group of us sitting around on our little stools in their living space, we thought it might be better suited to one of our virtual events. And at the end of today's conversation, I will give you a little bit of a preview of our Spring 2022 Art and Focus program, in which we are going back to in-person programs while keeping the virtual ones on separate days. But turning now to our lovely plaster cast of the Madonna and Child, which I've chosen with regard to the upcoming Christmas season. I have to give credit to Jesse, who is behind the scenes as the producer, who asked me in the run-up to Art and Focus how big this piece was, which made me realize I had forgotten to include a scale image, which I often like to do. I don't have a scale image, but I do have dimensions. So this is a fully round plaster cast, and it is 46 inches in diameter. So if it's helping you to imagine, this is a pretty large and robust piece of sculpture. Originally would have been marble. And it is, it's lovely. It's in wonderful shape as a historic plaster cast. And I think I've mentioned this before in Art and Focus, but Fairfield University Art Museum has a collection of more than 100 historic plaster casts. And by historic, I mean they are historical objects in their own right, created more than a century ago. This one came to us as a gift from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and many of them were cast at the end of the 19th century as an opportunity for those, especially in places like the United States, who would not be able to travel to Europe to see artworks in person, sculpture, elements of architecture. By taking a plaster cast directly from the original object, they were able to create these precise replicas of the art object that could be put in museums in New York, in London, other places around the world. Plaster casts are a little bit out of fashion today with a lot of people. Not with us. We love our plaster casts, not least for the amount of history that they contain, but because they still are fulfilling their purpose. The idea being to allow us to come face to face, quite literally in this case, with an art object, the original of which is 3,000 miles away. And in a few minutes, I will show you where the original of this object lives. It's still living in its original home in Italy, which I know we would all dearly love, probably to visit and take advantage of their wonderful warm weather. But if we can't get there, we have a plaster cast, which is giving us, as I said, this one-to-one replica of the original. So what are we seeing in this plaster cast? Obviously, at the center of this round shape, we have the Madonna, the Virgin Mary, with a halo behind her, a veil over her head, these wonderfully sculpted tendrils of hair coming down just underneath her veil. And she could be seated. We assume she could be seated. We can't see very much below the waist. But the way she's supporting the Christ child with one hand underneath his bottom kind of suggests she might be seated and he's perched on her lap. So we see the billow of her sleeves. And this is a relief sculpture. I mean, the whole thing is obviously three-dimensional, but the human figures are projecting outward from a flat surface. And Benedetto da Maiano was an extraordinarily talented sculptor of the Florentine Renaissance. And I want to direct your attention to the Madonna's right sleeve, which is in this wonderful flipped up fold that you can clearly see is sculpted three-dimensionally, is separate from the volume of the upper arm sleeve that is behind it. That is really extraordinary in a level of detail. And if you can imagine in the process of sculpting the marble original, as you're sculpting this projecting element, if you make a slip of the chisel and the sleeve breaks, there is no working around that. There is no repairing a projecting element like that. The entire composition would have been destroyed. So it is telling of the sculptor's skill, and he was very well established by 1490s, that he's able to push the boundaries of his medium like that. So we have this central group of the Virgin Mary whose eyes seem to be downcast. And I'd ask anyone watching if they want to put into the chat what their perception of the emotional state of the two people that we are looking at, the Virgin Mary and the infant Christ child. What do you take from their faces, from their body position, from the way they are interacting with each other and with us? Because of course, we're looking at an example of Catholic religious art. I should say Christian because we're before 1520. There is no Protestant Reformation just yet. So everyone who is practicing this religion at this time would call themselves Christian. So we have a work of Christian art that is intended for us. It is intended to speak to us and to move us, to remind us of veneration of the Virgin Mary, of the infant Jesus, and maybe to provide some other sort of interaction, which I'll return to in a few moments when we look at it in situ in Italy. What do we have besides the Virgin Mary and the Christ child in the center of this roundel? The Italian word for this round form is tondo, T-O-N-D-O, which really just means round. And this is an extremely popular compositional format for painters and for sculptors. And for some reason, it is very particular to Florence. It didn't really catch on in the 15th and 16th centuries in Rome or in Venice, but Florentine artists really took it and ran with it in multiple media. As I said, you'll find it in paintings, you'll find it in sculpture in marble. The original of this one is marble. You'll also find it in glazed terracotta. If you're familiar with Italian Renaissance art, you might recognize the name of the Della Robbia family, who made an industry off glazed terracotta roundels like this one in vivid colors with the Madonna and Child almost always in the center. So we have a couple of comments coming through the chat about what I asked about the sort of emotional connection between the Virgin Child and us as the viewer. Elisa says, I feel like baby Jesus is doing something he shouldn't be doing, and the Madonna is looking on in amusement. I like that. I'd ask, what's in baby Jesus's left hand? It looks like there could be a ball or something there. Maybe he's been throwing things at his cousin John the Baptist. We don't know who could be out of frame. Eva Jane says she's looking down with a mother's love for her human child, but also with a sense of awe that he is God in the flesh, which I think is a great interpretation that works well with sort of the original context and understanding of objects like this one. Often, and it's not necessarily the case in this particular sculpture, but often when we see depictions of the Virgin Mary, and people will ask, why doesn't she look happy? She has this healthy baby boy with her. Why doesn't she look thrilled? Why does she look downcast? And the answer to that is there was a popular understanding, popular meaning of the people and not written anywhere in the New Testament, that the Virgin Mary had a sort of divine presentiment of what her son's future was going to be. So on the one hand, as we just heard, we have a woman looking at her child with love for him, a maternal love, but sometimes mixed with this tinge of sadness over knowing what he's going to suffer in the future, even if that's all mixed up with knowing that in their understanding that he is God on earth. Mr. Roberts comments, it seems that Jesus's right hand could be offering a blessing to viewers. And I think that's absolutely true. So we see that the right hand of the Christ child is lifted in this gesture. He has two fingers they're more sort of curling up than mine. So, and he has, of course, a very tiny little baby hand. But this little gesture is, in fact, a gesture of blessing. So we have the Virgin Mary looking down at her child, maybe with some complicated emotions, and the child not looking back at his mother, but turning outward to us as the viewer. And around them, in this round composition, we have sort of multiple layers. There's the layer that is sort of the furthest from us, the flat surface behind the mother and child, out of which everything else is projecting. And then we sort of move up a layer of relief. We see shadowing behind the figure, the head of the Virgin Mary, showing us that layer with these angel heads with wings coming out of the side of them. Think of them as shorthand angels. Not enough space to sculpt the entire body of a little cherub, so you give the head, which are done in remarkable sense of detail for being pretty low relief, not pushing far off the surface. And then you put some nice fluffy wings next to them, and it's a sort of shorthand of heaven, which I would suspect also the emblem of the star with the sort of stylized 3 layers of clouds is intended to suggest the celestial sphere for those angels. Kathy echoes that she thinks, yes, that he is looking at us. Eva Jane comments, the Old Testament was full of references to both the suffering Savior and the Messiah, Israel's King. Mary was told that her child would save his people, the Jews, from their sin. So that's a great connection to a much longer story, reminding us too that Mary and Jesus were Jews. There was no Christianity, right? So they are working off what they understand of the coming of the Messiah, which then Christians believe that Jesus was the fulfillment of that Old Testament promise. And Janet adds, I feel Mary looks at her baby Jesus with bemusement, but Jesus feels his fate ahead of him. That's really interesting. So Janet is sort of flipping it. So it's Mary is focusing maybe on the baby and whatever he's doing, but it's Jesus who is here with a certain sense of gravity. And I would agree with that. I think it goes back to what the other viewer said about the gesture of blessing. I mean, you don't often get actual infants who are tumbling around stopping to make a blessing gesture at those around them, right? So the fact that he is able to make this concerted gesture does kind of suggest awareness of his role in this greater story. So we have our figures, we have our angels, our cherubim heads in the first band, and then on the outer band, we have sort of a riot of fruits and vegetables. I would invite anyone who wants to see if they can pick out sort of what is in there. I think I've spotted some pomegranate, maybe some squash, wheat, ears of wheat, the things that speak of plenty. And there are so many roundels like this that have varying garlands in the outer layer. Sometimes it's all fruit and vegetables, sometimes it's all flowers, and it adds, I think, a level of visual interest. And as we'll see in a moment too, we're not getting in this plaster cast any of the color that would likely have been present on the original. And we'll get to see the original in just a moment. But since I'm speaking about color, this is one of our reference photos. So I was not able to get into the Jesuit residence to take an in situ photo of the plaster cast today, but this is one of the photos the museum uses for reference. And you'll notice it has a downside of that it is cropped top and bottom, so we're not even getting the full space of the roundel. We have 2 sets of photographs, and I was interested to see as I was preparing for this Art in Focus talk that we have this set, which has sort of a warm tone to it. Oh, that's just making it bigger. I should have done that earlier. I apologize. But we also have this set of photographs. And so these are both taken in color, but the lighting is different. So we have the very warm toned light that is giving this plaster cast this appearance, I think, of greater warmth. And then we have the version that is lit a little bit more coolly that might perhaps bring to mind more of the original marble surface. One is not necessarily better than the other. I chose to use this one because it has the largest and most complete image of the entire 46-inch wide plaster surface. But it's just a reminder of that when we are doing something like this, especially virtually, we're being mediated by technology. So not just the screen, the Zoom through which I'm talking to you, but then also the images that we have may differ from how we would have perceived this object in the flesh. And that, of course, too, would depend on what kind of lights are there in the Jesuit residence if we were sitting around it. So always a good reminder that the real object, our ultimate goal in art history, is always to come face to face with the real object if we can, which we'll look forward to doing again next semester. But for a little change of scenery, I would like to take us on a few moments excursion to Italy, and specifically to the hilltop medieval town of San Gimignano, which is in the region of Tuscany, not that far from Florence. Florence is where Benedetto da Maiano was based. He was from a family of artist. His older brother was an architect. He himself trained as a sculptor under one of the luminaries of sculpture, Rossellino, of sort of the previous generation. And Benedetto da Maiano became one of the most famous sculptors of mid to late 15th century Florence. So this is not that far of a train ride from Florence if you're traveling in Tuscany. And it is in all the guidebooks because it is a rare example of an Italian hilltop town that still has most, if not all, of its medieval towers. These are defensive structures from an earlier and more chaotic time in Italy's history, and most towns and cities tore them down. So Florence doesn't have them anymore, but they did once. I think they've got like one left. San Gimignano still has a lot of them. And if you're wandering around San Gimignano, you might find yourself at the Church of St. Agostino, which is sort of the second most famous church in San Gimignano. Benedetto da Maiano worked in the largest and most famous church of the city called the Collegiata. And if you look up his name and the name of this town, you're going to find yourself taken to his work in that church. But our roundel comes from this church. It's a medieval Dominican church. You see it's very plain exterior. You see a couple of people walking from what is the contemporary entrance for tourists on the side. But of course, if we were entering in the 15th century, we would have entered through the main doors that we're seeing here on the left under that large round window. I also want to point out on the long side of the building, you see that smaller round window? It's not very deep. Keep that in mind because that's going to help us place where we are in just one moment. So now we are looking at what's called the counter facade of the entrance wall of Sant'Agostino. So we have entered in through that door where you can see light coming in at the left. We've turned to face what would have been the original entrance. And to the left of those original entrance doors, we see a chapel, and that is the chapel of SanBartolo. And here's where I'm going to ask Jesse to drop into the chat a link to a YouTube video for anyone who might be interested. It has there's no audio. It's shot by an Italian, but they're not speaking in Italian. And it's just quite an in-depth video tour of this church. And in fact, something I'm not showing you, the most famous thing in this church is not what we're about to look at. Rather, it's behind us. It's on the altar wall. It's a series of frescoes of the life of St. Augustine by Benozzo Gozzoli, who was another famous Florentine artist. So all of that to say, we have the second most important church in San Gimignano, and not even the most artistically significant thing inside the church, but it's still pretty cool. So this is a close-up of the chapel of SanBartolo, the tomb of SanBartolo, who was a sort of local saint. So we are looking straight ahead at, we can see as a rectangular structure, that would be the tomb of the saint. There's a architectural and sculptural sort of surround that goes around it, pilasters, flat columns on the outside leading up to this nice cornice. We see we have two kneeling angels above that. And then in the wall above, here's our roundel in its original marble form. So I wonder, for those of you who are watching, who are thinking about what your impression of the sculpture's interaction with us, what it is, when we were looking at it head on, does that change for you at all seeing the original viewing position? So taking us back to looking a little bit further away, we see there's a metal rail that's sort of preventing us from walking directly into the chapel. But if that weren't there and we walked in and stood in front of it, we would have to look up to see the roundel on the wall. We wouldn't be looking at it directly ahead. In fact, we will be looking at another version of the Virgin Mary straight ahead, a three-dimensional sculpture, also by Benedetto da Maiano. But it's interesting to think about, I had said before, everything being mediated through technology. Well, when we have a totally separate object like our plaster cast, we can choose whether we actually place it up on the wall very high or we place it at eye level. And I think most people would kind of expect it to be placed in a museum in the Jes-Res where you can see it. But its original context would have been a little bit different, high above and one part of what is in fact a very colorful, I mean that literally, very colorful setting. So giving people a moment to comment if they want, how they think their engagement with this sculpture might have changed if they saw it in the original setting. I don't know, I haven't been able to find out yet, who is the 15th century painter responsible for the frescoed saints that we can see on the wall at the left? but at least some of this painted decoration I would suspect is a 19th century reconstruction. And the reason that I say that is that if you look at the red column on the screen at the right, and you follow it up above its sort of floral capital, and you follow it up a little further, you see where the decoration sort of is cut in half. There's plain plaster on one side, and there's decoration on the other. That suggests to me that that might have been an indication that this is restored, sort of giving a sense of the flavor that it might have had, but not necessarily fully original to the chapel. That said, I don't know. And this actually sent me down an interesting research rabbit hole of trying to find the best research materials on a Benedetto da Maiano, but of course, that would require some trips to museum libraries or to libraries like the one at the Frick Collection in New York, so that is to be done at a later date. But what I would like to point out, whether these are original or a slightly fanciful recreation, the artist has mimicked some of the garland that surrounds that central roundel, both in the arch that's going up above, that's the at the end wall, and also if you look at the window on the left, you will see fruit and sheaves of wheat going around, and that's painted. It's not sculpted. Someone commented, Mr. Roberts said, many distracting pieces around the roundel. Yeah, there is a lot going on. And it's a reminder that, our aesthetic taste is, of course, not always going to match what was the reigning taste of the mid to late 15th century. They liked profusion. And you'll notice it's not even one medium we have here. We have both sculpture and painting. We have sculpture. The curtains that you see pulled back there are sculpted in marble and then painted on top of that. And in fact, our roundel, we can make out that the disc behind the human figures is painted dark, making them pop forward. And we can see what seems to be the remaining of gold adorning not only the background behind the cherub heads, but also on top of the garland surrounding it. We had a question a moment ago from someone, oops, just going up in the chat here. Kathy had asked what the symbols were between the encircling angels, and it was a star over, I'm going to just go back to the details so we can look at it together. It's a star, and then there are these very stylized three, what I think are intended to symbolize clouds. And I think the intention there, in conjunction with what would have originally been gold paint, or at least yellow paint, would have been to conjure up a vision of heaven, which would have been suitable for our angel friends. Besides the comment about the roundel being a little bit distracting, Eva Jane says, I don't see the baby's right hand in the marble sculpture, and he appears to be leaning back against his mother. Perhaps it's just the angle. I think that's a really great question. The angle is really different, and it's actually just also this picture is blurry. So I found the picture in the preceding photo, and I cropped it to make this detail. But if you can see my mouse on screen, the blessing hand of the child is right here. There's sort of a shadow in the center of it. But the angle changes how we perceive it, absolutely. I think that's a really great observation. Jennifer M. says the color palette really makes the sculpture come alive. I think that's absolutely true. It's sort of pushing the whiteness of the marble toward us. And Elisa says, I prefer seeing it alone without all the other sculptures in the chapel. I think it distracts from its majesty. And I think it's undeniable whether you like the colorful surroundings or you don't like it. It's certainly true that it is different. It is very different to see it in its original setting, even if restored, even if brightly restored, than to see the plaster cast that we have. It's absolutely a different viewing experience. And Janet observes that the unfurling of Mary's robe, I'm going to go back to our plaster cast to give it pride of place. It is our art object of the day. The unfurling of Mary's robe on either side of her echoes the wings of the angels surrounding her, increasing Mary and Jesus as sacred beings. I think that is a great observation, because clearly, too, multiplication is also kind of a theme here, in the sense that we have the same floral or vegetal garland around this roundel being repeated in some of the painted decoration. We have a roundel of the Virgin Mary above the tomb, and a three-dimensional sculpture of the Virgin Mary without the infant Christ directly atop the tomb. So there was no objection, clearly, in sort of repeating images and themes to reinforce what the ultimate goal is. And when I had said earlier, the idea that this is art that is intended to speak to us. When we see it in this church in Italy and it's above a tomb and we are looking up at it instead of looking at it, it is a reminder that this space is designed around the viewer, around the worshiper. So designed around a member of the faithful who has come there, maybe to venerate the saint that is buried there. And it is designed around us in a way that, not all art, as when we think about contemporary art, is not necessarily designed to impact us. That is the only goal, in some respects, of the work that Benedetto da Maiano is doing in the sculpture and in the whole organization of the tomb that we just looked at. If anyone else has any other comments or observations that they would like to share, I'm sure you're all looking for making your plans to get out your lonely planet and think about a visit to San Gimignano in the future. I did want to give a little bit of a preview of our next semester's offerings. So I have mentioned in past Art in Focus meetings that we decided in the spring, based on feedback from our viewers, many of whom are not local to Fairfield, Connecticut, that we will continue to do virtual Art in Focus just like this. But we are also going to dip our toe into getting back together in person. So I know this image is a little bit blurry on the right because I screen capped it from our upcoming Spring 2022 program brochure, which will be available soon on our website. But it's giving you a preview of at least the dates. So if you are only interested in the streaming, the virtual Art in Focus like we're doing now, on January 20th, we'll be talking about Alexander Lunois' color lithograph bullfight that you see there at the right. And if you want to come to the Bellarmine Hall Galleries in person 1 week later, you can look at that object together with me in person. So it's totally up to you if you would like to only do streaming or if you really want to hold out for virtual. You can do both if you want. I mean, make some observations online and then bring those and test them against the actual object. In February, we'll be looking at a screen print from our show of contemporary Chinese art that will be on in our Walsh Gallery. In March, March is a little bit of an exception. There is one that we're doing only virtual. That's the anti-slavery seal, Josiah Wedgwood. And then in April, we'll be looking at the painting that you see on the left by Lawrence Jeep. It's a painting, was originally a poster for the Olympics in 1936. The painting is extraordinary, and it's hanging right outside our director's office right now. So we're going to move it into the gallery just for the pleasure of sitting around and talking about it on April 21st, but we're going to talk about it virtually on April 14th. So I hope that is not too confusing. We will have all of these on our Eventbrite, and they will all be listed separately. So you will know very clearly whether you are registering for a reminder to tune in for a virtual Art in Focus, or you're letting us know that you're planning to come to Fairfield for an in-person Art in Focus event. And I thank you to Eva Jane, who said very grateful that the virtual programs will continue to be offered. Thank you to the Quick Museum at Fairfield. What a wonderful new renaming for us. So we appreciate very much being hosted by the Quick Center for the Arts. We are the Fairfield University Art Museum. No harm done, but we might as well say our name and say it proudly. We are happy to own such beautiful objects, to be their custodians, and to share them with you in Art in Focus events. So thank you so much to everyone who has tuned in today, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the spring, whether again on screen or in person in the galleries. Take care, everyone.